Hello, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn City Presbyterian Church. We received a National Trust for Historic Preservation grant, and you can too, from the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. Our presenter today is Pam Wilks with the City Presbyterian Church. Pam has attended City Presbyterian Church in Midtown Oklahoma City, Heritage Hills neighborhood since 2013. Her semi-retired status, she volunteers time to the church for several programs. One of these areas concerns the care of the historic building they occupy. Thank you for being here, and I will turn things over to you, Pam.
Thanks, Linda. I appreciate that. And thank you guys for being here today and for your interest in this topic. Just to get started, and Linda already said a lot of this, but I am here to represent my church, City Presbyterian Church. We also go by City Pres, so you'll hear me say that a lot. And I am not on staff. I'm simply a congregation member and the person who had the privilege of pursuing the grant. So I thought that I would share with you guys today more about the grant process and just how I went through that, because it was a learning experience for me. And I think it can be daunting sometimes when you're looking at different options and that sort of thing. So my role with City Pres, as I said, I am just a congregant. I've attended since about 2013. I've always had a love of architecture and an interest in that, and especially in historic structures. And now that I'm semi-retired, I just kind of felt called to do this because I had some time and capacity. And I also have a pretty extensive background with federal government contracting. And so through that federal proposal process, my company worked on contracts for FAA and the military and several government agencies. And so there's a lot of similarities between federal proposals and application process with a federal agency. So now the research and the process that I went through to find the grant opportunities and write the application was definitely a learning curve. So that was new for me. So basically I went through all of that, and then I kind of managed the process from start to finish. So let me tell you a little bit about City Pres and who we are, and some of the significance of the building and the members. We began in 2011 as a brand new church. We are intentionally situated in the Midtown inner city area of Oklahoma City. We're part of the Presbyterian Church of America, which is called the PCA for short. And there were no PCA churches within the Oklahoma City limits back in the 2010-2011 timeframe. And our founding pastors cast a vision of a church both loving God and just serving the city well. That's a very big emphasis on our church and our culture and our mission. Serving is core to our values. And in fact, in 2017, we helped launch an Oklahoma City nonprofit called Restore OKC that basically ministers to neighbors in Northeast Oklahoma City, and it's in a community that's deeply affected by generational poverty. We also maintain an on-site exchange, a free clothing closet that's open to anyone in need. And serving again and helping others isn't just our vision statement. Our members really do aspire to live that out together. So a note about the historical architectural importance of our building. It was originally known as Pilgrim Congregational Church, and it was constructed in 1920. City Pres bought the building in 2014. It is a late Gothic style, revival style architecture with load-bearing brick exterior and limestone embellishments. The north facade has two towers with large glass windows and large stone tracery. And historically, as I understand it, they contained stained glass. The dominant interior feature is the oak and steel roof truss system with the ornamental pendants, and that's what you can see here in this photo. It's really beautiful inside. So for other historical significance, just some fun facts. From 1920 to 1932, the membership of the Pilgrim Congregational Church was comprised of numerous government, business, and civic leaders. A special note, because of the church's free-thinking ideals, it was really an oasis for some of Oklahoma's leading publishers of the time. Leading members were E.K. Gaylord, the publisher of the Oklahoma City newspaper, and the Harlow family, who published a statewide magazine. They published textbooks and also a national Who's Who in America series. And additionally, at that time, the minister, Dr. Frank Sheldon, was also a well-educated and noted author. So, like I said, I'm going to talk today a little bit about the proposal process, just kind of give you an overview of where we started and walk you through my experience, hopefully to give you kind of a step-by-step explanation of how it went. I will talk about the emphasis on the importance of the preparation and the documentation, again, all with the goal to preserve history and maintain the integrity of our precious historic buildings. So to start with, I had to go out and find what is available. All I could think was we need maintenance and repair on our building. It's old. What sources are out there that are available? And I know you probably can't read this screenshot very well, but basically I just Googled it and looked at national organizations. In the search bar, I just searched grants for historical building restoration. The results that came up were primarily NPS, National Park Service, FEMA, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I always get stumped up on that one. And specifically with the National Trust, there's the Cynthia Woods Mitchell grant for interiors and the Joanna Favreau grants. And the Cynthia Woods Mitchell is actually the grant that we received. It was strictly for interior repair. And in addition to that, you can also find the Fund for Sacred Places if you're interested specifically in a grant for a religious organization. Also, I would say too that sorry, let me get back to that in a minute. Let's look at the next one. Then I looked at state level resources, and of course that took me to the SHPO website, and I found a lot of resources there. There's a lot of information that didn't necessarily apply to us, but might apply to you and your organization. We did look at the tax credit program in addition to some other things that were offered, but those were not the right avenues for us, so we didn't go down that route. But if you look at this particular page within the SHPO website, you'll see a lot of different organizational opportunities for different types of entities and organizations. So I also found this consultant database very useful. I met Michael Hoffner, an Oklahoma City-based architect, which he may be on here, so shout out to Michael if he's here. He helped me early on, and I knew that he was familiar with the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation, and that was the difficulty early on was navigating and figuring out who had experience with historical properties and who, knew what the standards were, because all of the grants basically required that any repairs that are done or any rehabilitation had to be done to the Secretary of Interior standards. And then ultimately, I also found the construction company that we used off of the consultant section of the SHPO's website. So there's a lot of good contacts in there, and I would definitely encourage you to look at that. I mentioned that's the consultant list there. I mentioned the Fund for Sacred Places. That was actually the first grant that I applied for, which I didn't get. But our dream project several years ago was to entirely renovate an educational wing on the back of our building, and it had been added on in the 1970s. I didn't mention earlier, but our building, when we occupied it in 2014, it had pretty much been vacant for the better part of the last 35 years. So it had a lot of, as you can imagine, when you have a vacant building, there's just a lot of disrepair and, needed a lot of attention. So that back part, which we consider our educational wing, easily needed $1 million investment. And it also needed an elevator because it's 3 stories. So the first grant that I applied for was with the Sacred Places, and it was a $250,000 ask, but it required a 2-to-1 match. And we didn't get this grant, but the reason that I mention it is because it was a great learning process for me. And, while it's fiercely competitive, they get, I think, over 300 applications a year, and they only awarded, at the time, I think they were awarding to maybe 25 or 30 at the most. And I think it may even be less than that now. But I mention it because they produced a webinar every year that described the process of applying. It provided some good insight and, was really helpful to any of the grant application processes. So I would encourage anybody interested in pursuing grants that doesn't really know where to start. You might just look at that and attend a webinar to learn about it. So the first step, once you identify something that you're interested in, is to just confirm, your eligibility for it. They all have specific rules and specific organizational preferences. And so, just going through to match your project to the goals of the grant and making sure that your organization matches up with that, and review all the documentation that's required for the application. Usually you can find that early on. Historical designation. I was quite surprised to learn that it isn't always a requirement. In fact, in the grant that we received, it wasn't a requirement. And while our building is on the National Registry, and so that wasn't a concern for me, it shouldn't be a deterrent. So if you're representing a building that's not registered, push forward, because that's not always required. Of course, you need to know your entity type, the type of organization, the tax status, and whether they're, educational, museum, nonprofit. They have a lot of set aside grants and funding sources for Native and Indigenous organizations. So anytime on these grants, often you can look back and see archival info. You can find information and articles. I mentioned the webinars that I was able to attend for the Sacred Places Fund. And I do say that it's really important that you set deadlines, set your reminders in your calendar, because they all have different deadlines. They don't all happen at the same time. And if you're not doing it full time, even if you are doing it full time, it's a lot to keep up with if you have several opportunities that you're considering pursuing. So you want to be sure and put, if they have they sometimes have a level of interest request where they have you submit a letter that's just even way before the actual application happens. So just make note of all the different deadlines. That's really important, and have that in your calendar. So also what I did was I reviewed some past applications and looked at former winners of grants and what kind of organizations they were and what kind of projects they had requested money for. And just was able to identify some common themes and some language that started to kind of form into a story, because I really feel like whenever you're writing a response to an application for a grant, you want to tell your story. And the most important thing is to explain the why to the grant questions and the evaluation criteria, and why you're the best recipient for that money, because it is competitive. And so if you start thinking of it as a story, that kind of helps, I think, as you put things into perspective and start to decide how to respond to the grant application questions. So again, start with your why, prepare detailed answers to the application questions. I had to dig on several of these for what they call the evaluation criteria, but it's also, I feel, very important that you find out what the evaluation criteria is, because that's what you're being rated on or scored on. And it is possible, once you understand what those criteria are, to include that in your responses to the answers for the questions, and, including historical data and references. I found it best to download the application questions, which you can do, and then, to put it into Microsoft Word and write your responses there. That way you can wordsmith things and, just do what you need to do to get it sounding perfectly, and then you can upload it later. And I will say that the character limits were one of the more difficult aspects of that, because they do have character limits, and you're entering this question format into a web portal for the grant. And so it's not like you're just able to email them a Word document. That's why it's important to have it in Microsoft Word. You can actually do a character count. And for some of them, they would ask a question and it might be 1,000 or 1,500 character limit. And while that sounds like a lot, it's really only about 6 or 8 sentences. So once you start doing that, you can find out quickly that, oh, wow, I have to really pare down what I'm saying here and still get my point across. And that's one of the bigger challenges, I think. So make your plan, learn ahead of time. Are there any requirements to plan for that you don't already have a perfect story to tell about? Sometimes, like, for example, in this situation, the thing that came up for me was, one of the requirements of the grant, and one of the questions it asked was, how do you publicly share what the grant funding did for you? And so I worked with the SHPO, and again, thanks to them for allowing me to do this lunch and learn, because this was a great way for me to say, once our project is done, I'm going to be able to publicize it. And the grantors are very concerned about that in the grants that I've dealt with. So that was something that I had to plan months ahead of time. I had to contact my representative at the SHPO and just find out more about the Lunch and Learn program and how it worked, and figure out how I could maybe be a part of that later. So we were able to write that into our application. And then, of course, I had to take notes and photos throughout the whole process and the project to create the video presentation. So partner with professionals. Again, I used the SHPO consultant list off of their website. I connected with several local experts. I wanted to select a general contractor based on the Secretary of Interior's standards and requirements, and the knowledge that they had and the experience that they had working under those requirements. And so that was really important. And that consultant list was a really great tool and a good place to start. So again, starting ahead of time is probably one of the biggest keys and things that I can emphasize the most, because well in advance of the application, you need to already have a pretty good idea of what you're going to ask for, how much money you're going to need to ask for. You're going to need to confirm your contractor's qualifications, and that all takes time. So you want to start way ahead of the cycle for the application, so you have all the information when the application opens up and it's time to input everything. So part of that's developing a budget, and you have to rely on other people to do that. Obviously, you have to get contractor estimates. You have to demonstrate your organization's ability to raise matching funds. You have to be prepared to write and show that you have a plan to do this. And then in my case, we had done a capital campaign before and had fundraised when we bought the building in 2014. So I was able to do some research and talk to some people that were involved in that at the time, and basically pull up all the information, the data, the numbers, and the things that were relevant to demonstrate that we had done that in the past, and therefore we could do it again. It's just a validation, I think. So also contingency planning, and I will say I did not do this, but this is something in my experience that was really important. Our original application was to do plaster repair. That was the project that we did. It was on both sides of our sanctuary. And we have five large windows on each side, so 10 windows total. And so our plan was to completely refinish the walls on both sides of the sanctuary. Well, whenever we got the grant award, we only were given about a third of the funding that we asked for. So we had to step back and reduce the scope considerably. So it's kind of good to think about ahead of time, I think, if you have an idea, if we don't get all the money we want, what does half of this project look like, or a third of this project? Because once we received the money, we had to do the same project that we had written the application for. So we couldn't just change it and go buy an HVAC system, for example. So we had to stick to what had been approved. But again, we weren't able to do the entire project. So that's kind of how we reduced our scope. And, it's good to think about it because, it's often not an all or nothing situation. And apparently they do often provide grant awards for lesser amounts than what the applicant has asked for. So good thing to keep in mind. So when you receive the award, yay, good news. That was a bright day, and we basically revisited the SHPO consultant list. Our plan was to go out and get additional bids. So time had passed since the original bids we had received, and so we had to revisit all of that. And we wanted to be sure we were getting the best price and the best value, and especially because we had to raise matching funds to add to the grant money. Value was really important to us. So the contractor that we basically chose for a combination of quality of their previous work. They had done similar previous work on other historical structures, historical commercial structures, and then also, of course, the price was a big factor as well. So here's some of our construction logistics, and I mentioned that it was a plaster rehabilitation or repair for our sanctuary. We had when we acquired the building in 2014, we had roof issues, and we had a lot of water intrusion that had happened during the time that it had been abandoned. And so we had a lot of plaster that was in pretty bad shape in our main sanctuary, which is, that's the first impression people get when they come into your church. If, people, our goal was to have weddings in there, and that would be an additional source of revenue for the church. And so that was important to me. But so our construction logistics started to shape up. The build project schedule was 10 days, which was very aggressive, but very important because we couldn't have services in our sanctuary during the time that this scaffolding was in there and the process was underway. So the scaffolding was one of our biggest challenges because a lot of the work area was the ceiling right above the window. You can see here in the picture, the scaffolding had to be really, really tall, and it had to be on both sides of the church, both the east wall and the west wall. So we made alternate arrangements for the weekend, for the one weekend in between for worship services. The contractor started on Monday, and they were projected to finish a week from that following Friday. So Monday through Friday, and then we were back in for the next weekend. So that was very important to us, and fortunately they were on time and did everything as as they had presented it, and it all worked out great. So there was a lot of daily progress tracking. They had a web portal, which was very helpful to me as the customer to kind of see where they were day by day. And I got an update every day of what they had completed, and just gave me a good assurance and comfort level that they were going to finish on time. So after the grant and after the work, each of these grants requires a final report. And for ours, because the Cynthia Wood Mitchell grant was part of the National Trust, we submitted that report to the National Trust. Required documentation of all the finances and where the matching funds came from, and photos and the outcomes of the project, how we publicized the work, and any other reflections or notes that were outside of that. Not hard at all, just something you have to be sure and plan and remember to do. So here I'm going to show you some pictures of just the work that we actually did. Basically, this is an example photo of the damage on the east side of our sanctuary. And again, I mentioned the height of the damaged plaster and the restoration itself were the two key challenges. The height because of the scaffolding, and obviously the restoration because it's just really, really difficult to find skilled plaster repair people that really know how to perform that work to the Secretary of Interior standards. There's not very many of them left around, and so that was a big challenge. So the project area, you can kind of see the yellow highlight, just gives you a feel of the size of the project. And then we also had a section like this on our west wall that we did. So here's a few before photos just to try to get it a little more up close and show you the actual damage there. You can see in the left photo up in the ceiling where everything's crumbling and falling apart, and same on the right photo, which that was a little bit worse because it was more closer to eye level while you were in the sanctuary. So really, really very obvious and not very pretty at all. A little bit more up close, and you can kind of see I took this shot on the right from the balcony looking down, so you can really see the more of the whole wall there where it's in pretty bad shape. So progress photos. So this was where we started. The first thing we had to do was stack and move about 400 chairs. So that was the first process. And then there was protection cover put down all over the carpet, and also there's some oak wood boxes on the side right under the windows that house part of our HVAC system. And so that was we particularly were worried about that because that was right under the area of restoration. And so they covered all that up, and that was a big process. And then just getting that scaffolding installed to ceiling height was a big project that seems like took at least a day or day and a half, maybe closer to 2 days initially. And then of course there was a tear down time at the end too. So here we are underway, and these 3 window sections here are they were meticulously scraped down and down to the lath, and then a gypsum plaster was reapplied, textured, and painted from the floor, and also included those 2 sections of the ceiling you can see there. A few more in progress shots here of the ceiling and the scaffolding just through different steps. Here's a before and after photo. I did a few of these, tried to get them up close where you could really see, but the left, obviously, the before, and the after on the right, which it looks so much better. It turned out really, really nice. All right, so this is the east side walls and ceiling, the before and the after on the right. And this is another section that I didn't mention earlier. It was an additional area that we have up in what we call our library, which is a loft area on the third floor, and it's right under the west tower. So again, with the water intrusion that we had before the roof was repaired, we have several spots that are in pretty bad shape. This was probably by far the very worst spot, but we're happy now that that's all cleaned up and looks good. There's a few after photos. That's the west wall, the east wall. So just some final thoughts here for you. The key takeaways, I think, are just plan ahead, do the research, allow several months of preparation time, and be thinking of your application as a story about why you should be the organization to receive the funding. Be sure you write your application responses to answer all of the questions and also the evaluation criteria. So I think that's it. I'll hand it back over to you, Linda.
Great. Thank you so much. It was great information about your project. So with that, I'm going to start with a couple of my own questions.
Okay.
So with the National Trust grants, are those reimbursable grants? And then how often did you apply to get your money?
So do you mean how often did I apply and not receive money, or how often did I apply along the way for one grant?
Basically, was it reimbursable, and how many times could you ask them for the money? Did you have to wait till the end and get the lump sum at the end, or could you ask for it during the project?
So actually, with the Cynthia Wood Mitchell grant, once we received the notification that we were awarded, they asked us for some additional documentation, a signed contract, and a couple of other things. And amazingly, they sent us a check like shortly after that, before we had even started the project. They fully funded the amount they awarded to us in that case. And so we received the check, on the condition that we were going to follow all of the details of the application we'd presented, and then provide them a final report at the end of the project.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Now I remember, I believe when I applied for the Sacred Places grant, that it was more structured in a, I don't know, what was the word for it? Just they came in phases. So yeah, you had a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and maybe it's because of the difference in the funding amount. I'm not sure, but in this case, we were fortunate that they just sent us a check for the whole amount once we had signed the contract.
Nice. Okay. So then another question I have for you is, how did you vet the contractors and consultants? Did you go out and look at their work on previous projects? What exactly were the steps you took to make your contractor selection?
Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned, I started with your consultant list, which was helpful. And I had a certain degree of comfort in that the people that were on that knew what they were talking about and knew about historical repair. But in addition to that, I met with the contractors numerous times. And so we were on site probably at least 3 or 4 times during the bidding process, and just making sure that I understood what they were bidding and what needed to happen, because I didn't know what the process was to do this repair, and yet I had to write the application for it. So I needed to understand that. So I just, had a good comfort level from working with them and feeling like I knew them. And then in addition to that, I just looked at their other projects that they had done, primarily on their website, and looked at and talked to them about them. And I don't think I called any references. I thought about calling references, but I had a pretty good comfort level with the one that we went with, looking at the work that they had done around in Oklahoma and different, historical commercial buildings.
Okay. So then you mentioned that this only funded 1/3 of your project. So
Right.
how are you all intending to complete?
Well, that's a good question, because fortunately, the pictures that you saw were absolutely the worst of the cracking and crumbling of our plaster. We have 2 or 3 other places, but they're really up real high near the, near the ceiling, and they're not near as bad. So already it just looks 100% better. Would we love to have done the entire wall? Yes, but that wasn't in the cards. So I think it's just going to be a matter of over the years, keeping an eye on these other places. We have replaced the roof, so we feel like the water intrusion has stopped. So I don't expect them to get any worse. So it's just going to be a matter of, as our church grows, when we can afford to fund it. It's really expensive, amazingly expensive to do even those small sections. So, and as I mentioned, we had to match the grant money, 1 for 1 to do that. And then it still ended up costing more than that.
And then to that end, how often can you apply for that grant through the National Trust?
So I haven't tried this, but I've heard and been told, like from the webinar that I watched on the Fund for Sacred Places and other National Trust information that I've looked at, I think you can reapply every year. They do ask you to disclose as part of the application if you've ever been a recipient before. And they also will often talk about, especially the Fund for Sacred Places and the higher dollar amount grants. I've heard them talk a lot about, what states they've never granted money to. And so I always felt like, ooh, they have a preference for Idaho because they've never given any money to Idaho before, So, but as I understand it, you can apply every year if you want to. It's just, I don't know how successful that would be if they've just given you money the year before. I always had the feeling that might not, depend on your project completely. It would